A billionaire CEO answers a trembling call from a little girl. She says his only son is lying unconscious on the street. In that instant, his empire means nothing, and his life is about to change forever. Jonathan Harper sat in his office high above the city, the floor-to-ceiling windows giving him a perfect view of New York's endless skyline. The afternoon sun painted the skyscrapers gold, and in the reflection of the glass, his light blue suit looked almost silver. He adjusted his cufflinks absent-mindedly, the kind of gesture that had become second nature to him over years of board meetings and negotiations. On the surface, Jonathan seemed untouchable, the billionaire CEO whose empire stretched across continents, the man who had every luxury at his fingertips. Yet that day, an unease he couldn't explain pressed against his chest, as though something invisible in the air was warning him. When the phone on his desk rang, the sound was sharp and unexpected, cutting through the quiet hum of the office like a blade. Jonathan leaned forward, expecting the calm voice of an assistant or perhaps another investor demanding his attention. Instead, what came through was small and trembling, the voice of a child, barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Harper, your son, he's lying on the street, he's not moving." The words stumbled out, broken by little sobs. For a moment Jonathan thought he had misheard, that it was some cruel mistake or prank. But the tone of the girl's voice carried something no adult could fake, raw fear, the kind that comes only when someone stares at something far bigger than themselves. His breath caught. The polished calm of the businessman vanished instantly, replaced by the primal panic of a father. He gripped the phone tighter, demanding to know where, asking questions he barely heard himself say. The girl stammered out an address between gasps, and Jonathan felt his entire world tilt. He pushed his chair back so suddenly it crashed to the floor, but he didn't stop to notice. The room that usually felt like the command center of his empire seemed to shrink around him, walls pressing in, every second stretching unbearably. His mind raced with flashes of his 6-year-old son, Daniel laughing in the garden, his blue eyes shining, his small hand clutching Jonathan's fingers on their walks together. Now those same eyes, he was told, were closed somewhere on a street, surrounded not by love, but by cold concrete. Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears as he rushed from the office. The world outside his window no longer looked like a city of power and opportunity. It looked like a labyrinth he had to tear through, street by street, second by second, to reach the boy who meant more than every deal, every fortune, every title he had ever won. In that moment, the billionaire was gone. There was only a father, terrified, desperate, running against time. Jonathan's car screeched to a halt at the edge of the street, tires biting into the asphalt as he flung the door open without even bothering to shut off the engine. His heart pounded so violently that it felt as though it might tear free from his chest. The sight before him froze him in place for an instant that felt like an eternity. There, on the rough pavement under the fading light of the afternoon, lay his son. Daniel's small frame looked impossibly fragile, his chestnut hair tousled as if a sudden gust of wind had swept through it. His light blue shirt was wrinkled, his dark trousers scuffed with dust, and his pale face seemed too still, too quiet for a child who usually radiated life and energy. Kneeling beside the boy was a little girl Jonathan had never seen before. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with long blonde hair that tumbled around her face in tangled strands. Her denim jacket hung loosely over a white dress, and both were slightly dirted from kneeling on the ground. Tears streaked her cheeks, and her small hands hovered helplessly above Daniel as if she wanted to do something but didn't know what. The moment she saw Jonathan, she looked up at him with wide, terrified blue eyes, and for a second he thought she might run away. Instead, she whispered in a trembling voice that cracked mid-sentence, "I don't know what happened, he just fell down, he wouldn't wake up." Jonathan dropped to his knees so hard he barely felt the sting of the concrete cutting through the fabric of his suit. He reached out and gently touched Daniel's face, desperate for some sign of warmth, some movement that would tell him this was not as bad as it looked. He pressed his ear close to his son's lips, holding his breath until he caught the faintest, shallow sound of breathing. Relief flooded him, so sharp it made his vision blur, but it was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by terror. His boy was alive, but barely. He tried to gather Daniel into his arms, but his hands trembled as though they belonged to someone else, shaking under the weight of fear rather than the child. The girl reached forward instinctively, as if to steady him, but then drew back quickly, her fingers curling into fists as though she realized she was intruding. She bit her lip, her face pale except for the blotches left by crying. Jonathan forced himself to meet her gaze, and in those frightened eyes he saw not just panic but also bravery. For all her fear, she had not run away, had not left his son alone on the street. She had stayed, even when she didn't know what else to do. The sound of distant sirens drifted through the city air, faint but growing louder, and Jonathan clung to that sound as if it were a rope pulling him back from the edge of a cliff. He murmured his son's name over and over, whispering promises, bargains, anything his mind could form in that storm of desperation. The girl remained on the ground, watching, trembling, whispering silent prayers to herself that he could barely hear. The chaos of New York swirled around them, cars honking, strangers gathering at a distance, the shadows of tall buildings stretching longer as the sun dipped lower, but for Jonathan, the world had narrowed to this single stretch of pavement, to a child lying still and another kneeling beside him, both bound now to his life in ways he could not yet understand. The wail of the ambulance siren grew louder until it filled the entire block, echoing off the glass and steel of the buildings like a relentless alarm that refused to be ignored. Red and blue lights painted the street in frantic flashes, and Jonathan barely registered the way people stepped aside as the paramedics rushed forward. He clung to his son's small hand as though letting go might mean losing him forever, whispering Daniel's name in a voice that cracked under the weight of fear. His usually steady hands, hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts and directed entire corporations, now trembled uncontrollably as they brushed his boy's hair away from his pale forehead. The paramedics knelt swiftly, their movements efficient, voices clipped and calm, but to Jonathan each word sounded like a sentence passed in a foreign language he barely understood. One of them checked Daniel's pulse while another fitted a small mask over his face, pumping oxygen into him with a practiced rhythm. Jonathan tried to stay close, but they gently pushed him back, telling him to give them space. The rejection tore at him like a physical blow. He wanted to scream that this was his son, his only boy, that he should not be kept at a distance, but the rational part of him knew they were right. His role now was not to act, but to hope. The little girl, the one who had made the call, hovered just behind him, her denim jacket slipping off one shoulder, her eyes following every movement with a mixture of terror and awe. Jonathan could feel her presence like a fragile anchor keeping him tethered to the moment. Without her, Daniel might have been left alone for too long. That thought sent a shiver through him that no amount of wealth or power could ever erase. As they lifted Daniel onto the stretcher, Jonathan's breath caught. The boy's small frame seemed swallowed by the straps and buckles, his face almost hidden beneath the mask. His chest rose and fell with the help of the machine, each breath a reminder of how thin the line was between life and something far darker. Jonathan followed them, stumbling slightly as his knees threatened to give out, his eyes never leaving his son's fragile form. The ambulance doors swung open with a metallic clang, and the paramedics slid the stretcher inside, their hands moving with precision and speed. Jonathan climbed in after them without hesitation, ignoring the shouts of orderlies who tried to keep him back. He would not be separated, not now, not when every second mattered. Inside the ambulance, the world became a blur of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the steady beeping of machines that tracked Daniel's faltering rhythm of life. Jonathan gripped the side rail of the stretcher so tightly his knuckles turned white, leaning close enough that his tears fell onto his son's shirt. He whispered words that were more prayer than comfort, promises that he would give up everything if only Daniel opened his eyes again. The paramedic glanced at him briefly, not unkindly, but with the detached calm of someone who had seen too many fathers like this, too many children balanced on the edge of survival. Through it all, Jonathan kept seeing flashes of memory, Daniel's laughter as he chased a ball across the yard, the way he had once fallen asleep on his father's chest after a long day, the sound of his little voice asking endless questions about the world. Those memories collided with the present image of his still, fragile body, creating a pain so raw that Jonathan thought it might break him. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, siren screaming, Jonathan felt for the first time in his life what true helplessness meant. He was a man who had built empires, but in that small, confined space, all he could do was hold on to his son's hand and pray that the boy would not slip away. When the ambulance finally screeched to a halt in front of the hospital, Jonathan felt as if time itself had dissolved into one long, breathless moment. The doors flew open, and a rush of cold air hit his face as the paramedics pulled the stretcher out with Daniel's small body strapped tightly to it. Jonathan leapt down beside them, stumbling to keep pace as they wheeled his son through the blinding white corridors, past the sterile smell of disinfectant and the distant hum of machinery. Voices overlapped, medical jargon filled the air, and the fluorescent lights above flickered in a rhythm that seemed to mock the frantic beat of his heart. A nurse tried to stop him at the swinging double doors leading to the emergency ward, telling him he could go no farther, but Jonathan's protest was cut short by the sudden weight of a small hand tugging at his sleeve. It was the girl. The same fragile figure he had first seen bent over Daniel's body on the pavement was now standing in the middle of the hospital corridor, her blonde hair tangled, her face still streaked with tears. She looked so small against the endless sterile walls, a child who had stepped into a world far too large and cruel for her. Jonathan crouched down to meet her eyes, his own face a map of exhaustion and fear. The girl's voice was soft, almost broken, as she said, "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't leave him there." Her blue eyes brimmed with guilt, as though she believed she should have done more, though she had already done the one thing that mattered most, she had saved Daniel from being alone. Jonathan asked her name, and she whispered, "Lily," her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. He learned, in bits and pieces, while sitting in the waiting room with her beside him, that she had no parents to run home to. She lived with an aunt who barely noticed if she came or went, and most of the time she wandered the streets on her own. That day she had been walking home from school when she saw Daniel collapse, and though fear gripped her like ice, she found a payphone and dialed the number she remembered from a flyer about his father's company. It was a wild guess, a child's desperate leap of faith, but somehow it had worked, and now Jonathan realized he owed her everything. Hours blurred together as he sat in that waiting room, every tick of the clock gnawing at his nerves. The polished marble floors and sleek designer chairs, meant to give a sense of calm and order, only deepened the sense of hollowness inside him. Through it all, Lily remained at his side, sometimes silent, sometimes whispering little reassurances that no adult could have offered with such innocent sincerity. She drew pictures on scraps of paper the nurses had given her, images of a smiling boy with bright eyes, and she would slide them toward Jonathan with the hope that they might keep him strong. He was stunned by her courage, by the strange bond already forming between them in the shadow of fear. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt powerless in every way that mattered. His empire, his billions, his connections, none of it had any weight in this place where the only currency was the fragile rhythm of a child's heartbeat. Yet, as he looked at Lily sitting quietly beside him, he also felt a flicker of something unexpected. There was a strength in her presence, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness could appear from the most unlikely corners of the world. That realization didn't erase the terror clawing at him, but it gave him something to hold on to, the belief that perhaps fate had not abandoned him completely, that perhaps Daniel had not been left without a guardian in that crucial instant. And though the night stretched endlessly ahead, Jonathan began to understand that the little girl who had picked up the phone might change his life as much as she had saved his son's. The days that followed moved with a punishing slowness, as though time itself had been stretched thin and cruel. Jonathan found himself living inside the hospital, his world reduced to the sterile white walls of his son's room and the steady, fragile beeping of the monitors that kept Daniel tethered to life. He sat for hours in a stiff chair by the bedside, his once immaculate suit wrinkled, his tie discarded, his face shadowed by stubble that he no longer cared to shave. Every breath Daniel took with the help of machines was both a relief and a torment, because Jonathan could not escape the knowledge that without them, his little boy might slip away. Each morning doctors would file in with cautious expressions, speaking in careful tones that never promised too much. Words like stabilized and monitoring became the only hope they dared offer, but to Jonathan they sounded like fragile shields barely holding back a flood of despair. He listened, nodded, and asked questions he already knew had no real answers. He wanted certainty, but certainty never came. His son remained locked in a silence that pressed against every corner of his heart, and for the first time in his life, Jonathan understood what it meant to be utterly helpless. Yet he was not entirely alone. Lily was always there, slipping into the room like a quiet shadow and settling in the corner with her crayons and scraps of paper. She drew pictures every day, pictures of Daniel laughing, running, playing in a garden that looked far brighter than the world they now inhabited. She would color the skies in shades of brilliant blue, the kind of blue that matched Daniel's eyes when they were open, and then she would hand the pictures to Jonathan as if they were talismans strong enough to protect him. At first, he took them with a distracted nod, but soon he began to study them in the quiet hours, finding comfort in the childish certainty that Daniel would smile again. In the long nights, when exhaustion pressed down on him and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to whisper of loss, Jonathan would look across at Lily curled up in a chair, asleep with her knees drawn to her chest, her denim jacket serving as a thin blanket. He wondered how someone so small could carry such courage, how she had managed to do what so many adults might have failed to do. He thought of her life, of the aunt who scarcely noticed her, and the loneliness that must have shaped her little world, and his chest tightened with something deeper than gratitude. It was a fierce, protective instinct, the kind he had thought he could only ever feel for his son, but now it reached out toward this girl who had appeared in his life by chance, or perhaps by fate. The days blurred into one another, measured not by clocks or calendars but by the rhythm of Daniel's shallow breaths and the soft scratch of Lily's crayons on paper. Jonathan abandoned meetings, phone calls, and the endless machinery of his empire, all of which now seemed meaningless compared to the fragile battle being fought in that single hospital room. His assistants tried to reach him, his board demanded updates, but he ignored them all. He was no longer the unshakable billionaire commanding towers of glass and steel. He was a father waiting for his child to open his eyes, a man learning in the hardest way possible that money could not buy the one thing that mattered most. In those endless hours, Jonathan felt the weight of every mistake he had ever made, every moment he had spent chasing power instead of cherishing the time with his son. He promised silently, again and again, that if Daniel came back to him, he would change everything. He would be more present, more human, less consumed by the hollow victories of his empire. And each time he whispered those vows, he felt Lily's quiet presence close by, as though she were listening, as though she too believed that his words carried power. What he could not yet see, though it was already beginning, was that these dark, unbearable days were not only forging a new strength within him, but weaving the first fragile threads of a bond that would soon redefine his family forever. It happened on a morning that at first felt no different from the countless others that had drained Jonathan of hope. The hospital room was hushed except for the rhythmic hum of the machines and the faint rustle of nurses moving quietly in the hallway. Jonathan sat in his usual place by Daniel's bed, his body stiff from another sleepless night spent leaning forward in that same hard-backed chair. His head rested in his hands, and though he tried to remain strong, the weight of exhaustion and despair pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, her blonde hair falling around her face as she drew yet another picture, this one of a little boy holding a kite high against a brilliant sky. She worked in silence, but every now and then her eyes would flick toward the motionless figure in the bed, as though willing him to move. Jonathan lifted his gaze, drawn as always to his son's still face, when he saw it, the faintest twitch of movement, so small he thought for a moment his weary eyes had imagined it. He straightened instantly, heart hammering as he leaned forward, clutching the bed rail. Daniel's fingers shifted ever so slightly, curling against the blanket. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he whispered his son's name, barely daring to speak louder for fear the fragile moment might vanish. At first there was nothing more, but then Daniel's chest rose with a deeper breath than the machine had provided, and his eyelids fluttered with a hesitant, fragile effort. The sound that left Jonathan's lips was half a sob and half a laugh, a sound of disbelief breaking free after days of silence. He called Daniel's name again, this time stronger, his hand trembling as he reached to clasp the small hand that had finally stirred. Lily dropped her crayons with a clatter and scrambled to her feet, her wide blue eyes fixed on the boy in the bed. The monitors beeped with a change in rhythm, and the nurse who had just entered gasped softly before rushing out to alert the doctors. For Jonathan, the world narrowed to the moment when Daniel's eyes finally opened, dazed and glassy, but undeniably alive. "Dad?" The word was barely audible, a whisper so thin it seemed fragile enough to shatter if spoken again. But to Jonathan, it was the most powerful sound he had ever heard. He pressed his forehead to his son's hand, tears spilling freely down his face, his body shaking with relief so intense it felt like pain. He murmured reassurances, promises, and gratitude all at once, words tumbling out in a rush as he kissed Daniel's small fingers over and over. Lily stood beside the bed, hands clasped against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks as though the moment belonged to her just as much. Doctors and nurses poured into the room, voices brisk and urgent as they checked Daniel's vitals, adjusted monitors, and spoke in quick succession, but their presence barely registered in Jonathan's mind. All he could see was his son's half-awake gaze, struggling to focus but filled with the undeniable spark of life. The boy was weak, his voice faint, yet the way he tried to hold on to Jonathan's hand was stronger than any force in the room. For hours afterward, Jonathan refused to leave his son's side, clinging to every word, every glance, every fragile smile that Daniel managed to muster. The hospital remained a place of beeping machines and sterile walls, but for Jonathan it had transformed into the site of a miracle. He had stared into the abyss of loss, felt its weight press down on him until he thought he would break, and yet in that instant when his son's eyes had opened, light had returned to a world that had grown unbearably dark. Lily remained close, hovering like a guardian, her small frame nearly vibrating with relief. Though she said little, Jonathan could see it in her expression, the victory belonged to her as well, for without her courage none of this would have been possible. And as Daniel drifted back into a healing sleep, Jonathan sat back, gripping both children's hands, realizing with a clarity that struck him deep in the heart that his life would never be the same again. In the weeks after Daniel's awakening, the sterile world of the hospital slowly gave way to the warmth of home, though Jonathan found himself changed in ways that made his old life feel like a distant echo. He no longer spent his mornings buried in reports or his evenings locked in endless meetings. Instead, every ounce of his attention was drawn to his son, who was regaining strength day by day. The first time Daniel managed to sit up on his own, Jonathan felt a rush of pride so fierce that it brought tears to his eyes. Every small step forward, each smile, each laugh, each word spoken with more energy, became a victory greater than any financial triumph he had ever achieved. Yet even in these joyous moments, his gaze often drifted to Lily, who was never far from Daniel's side, and he realized with growing certainty that this girl, who had appeared in their lives by chance, now belonged within the very heart of it. Lily had settled into a quiet rhythm within the Harper household, her presence as natural as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. At first she had been shy, reluctant to step too far into the brightness of this new life, always watching from the corners as if she expected someone to tell her she did not belong. Jonathan noticed the way she hesitated before accepting simple kindnesses, a warm meal placed before her, a soft bed prepared in the guest room, even a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was as though she feared that each gesture would be taken away the moment she dared to believe in it. But Daniel, with the innocent determination of a child, never let her retreat for long. He insisted she sit beside him at dinner, pulled her into his games, and shared his toys without a second thought, as if his heart had already recognized her as the sister he never had. One evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep with his hand still clutching a toy car, Jonathan found Lily in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked small and fragile against the vastness of the room, her eyes fixed on the flickering fire in the hearth. He sat beside her, not speaking at first, giving her the space to decide whether she wanted to talk. After a long silence, she whispered that she had never really known what it felt like to be safe, that her aunt's house was never a home but only a place she slept. Her voice trembled as she admitted she often wondered if she mattered at all to anyone. Jonathan's heart clenched at her words, and he realized with a clarity that stunned him that he could not allow her to drift back into that loneliness. The decision formed not out of impulse but from a depth of feeling he could no longer deny. He began the process of adoption, navigating the maze of legal documents and official procedures with a determination that rivaled any business deal he had ever fought for. This was not about strategy or profit but about something infinitely greater, giving a child who had saved his son the chance to finally belong. Lily's eyes widened when he told her, her expression a mixture of disbelief and hope so raw it nearly broke him. She asked him if he was certain, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the air between them. Jonathan assured her that not only was he certain, but that he had never been more sure of anything in his life. When the papers were finally signed and the day came to bring her home as his daughter in name as well as in heart, Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of completeness he had never known before. The family portrait that hung in the foyer no longer felt unfinished. There was now a place for her, not as a guest or an outsider but as someone who carried the same love and belonging as Daniel. The walls of the mansion, once echoing with silence broken only by the ticking of clocks and the occasional sound of business calls, now rang with the laughter of two children. For Jonathan, the shift was nothing short of transformative. He looked at Lily and Daniel together, one recovered from the brink of loss, the other rescued from a life of neglect, and he understood that this, above all else, was the true measure of wealth. The first true spring day arrived with a sky so clear it seemed to have been washed clean overnight, and Jonathan found himself standing in the garden of his estate watching his two children chase each other across the grass. The air was alive with their laughter, sharp and bright, echoing against the tall stone walls that once felt like barriers but now seemed to cradle the life within. Daniel's cheeks glowed with color again, the hollowness of illness replaced by the vibrant energy of a boy who had been given back his future. His legs carried him swiftly across the lawn, his chestnut hair catching the sunlight as he ran, his blue eyes sparkling every time he looked over his shoulder at Lily who was close behind, her denim jacket flapping as she sprinted after him, her own laughter mixing with his in a melody Jonathan could never have imagined just weeks earlier. He stood in his light blue suit, the same one he had worn on the day of the call, yet it no longer felt like armor or a symbol of power. It was simply clothing now, a shell around a man who had been stripped down to his very core and rebuilt by love and loss. He watched his children and realized that this was not just a new chapter in his life but an entirely new story, one that wealth alone could never have written. The empire he had once guarded so fiercely seemed distant and almost irrelevant compared to the living, breathing empire of joy before him. Every smile from Daniel, every sparkle of trust in Lily's eyes, reminded him that his fortune was not in the numbers on a ledger but in the bonds that had been forged in the fire of suffering. As the game of chase slowed, the children collapsed into the grass side by side, panting and laughing, pointing up at the clouds that drifted lazily above them. Jonathan walked over and lowered himself to the ground with them, feeling the earth solid beneath him, the scent of new blossoms in the air. Daniel rolled onto his side and tucked himself against his father, small fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeve. Lily leaned against Jonathan's other arm, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and in that moment the three of them formed a circle of warmth that no storm could break. Jonathan wrapped an arm around each child and held them close, closing his eyes as a peace unlike any he had known filled him completely. He thought of how close he had come to losing everything, how fragile the thread of life had been when Daniel lay unconscious, and how unlikely it was that a lonely little girl had been there at just the right moment to change everything. The memory of that call still haunted him, not with fear anymore, but with a deep gratitude that bordered on reverence. It was as though fate itself had intervened, weaving Lily into their lives not by accident but by design. He whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, to whatever force had guided her steps that day, and promised himself he would never take this second chance for granted. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long golden rays across the garden, Jonathan looked at his son and daughter and knew that their story would always carry the scars of what they had endured, but those scars would not define them. They would be reminders of strength, of love discovered in the darkest of moments, of the unshakable bond that had been born from pain. The shock of almost losing Daniel and the miracle of gaining Lily had reshaped him into someone he barely recognized, not a CEO, not a billionaire, but a father whose greatest fortune lay in the two small hands he now held. And as the children drifted into quiet, their laughter softening into contented sighs, Jonathan realized that the ending of their ordeal was not just happy, it was extraordinary, because it had given them not only survival but also the family they were always meant to be.